All right, digging in?
Looks delicious. Oh, yay, more. Thank you, honey.
I don't know how we're gonna handle this.
Mr. Davis, wait. Just give me 1 minute. I have nothing else to say, Daniel. No, please, just listen.
There are moments in life that break a person's heart in an instant. Not because someone walked away, not because money was lost, but because one unexpected truth erased years of love, trust, sacrifice, and memories all at once. Imagine working every single day to provide for your family, believing you were carrying the weight of your home on your shoulders, only to discover that the person you trusted more than anyone had been quietly watching your struggle while holding the key to your freedom the entire time. Imagine borrowing money from friends, selling your belongings, skipping meals so your children could eat, and lying awake every night wondering how to keep a roof over your family's heads, never realizing that your greatest obstacle wasn't a stranger, a recession, or bad luck. It was the person sleeping beside you every night. This is the story of Daniel Brooks, an ordinary American husband whose desperate search to save his family uncovered a secret so unbelievable that it left everyone who heard it asking the same question: how well do we really know the people we love the most? On a gray autumn morning outside a county courthouse in Ohio, Daniel Brooks stood alone with an eviction notice trembling in his hands. His eyes remained fixed on the paper as though reading it again might somehow change the words staring back at him. 3 months. That was all the time he had been given to leave the home where he and his wife had built a life together, celebrated birthdays, welcomed 2 children into the world, and believed they would grow old together. The lawyer who had handled every conversation about the property for years quietly walked down the courthouse steps without offering another word. Daniel called after him, asking for one last chance to explain, one last opportunity to speak directly with the owner of the building. His voice cracked as he said there had to be some mistake because he lived there with his wife and children, and they simply needed a little more time. The lawyer paused for only a second before continuing toward the parking lot, making it painfully clear that no amount of pleading would change the decision. Then something happened that Daniel would never forget for the rest of his life. A courthouse employee looked toward the entrance and casually pointed across the parking lot. "If you want to speak to the owner," the man said, "she just arrived." Daniel slowly turned his head. A black luxury SUV rolled to a gentle stop near the courthouse entrance. The driver's door opened first before a woman stepped out from the back seat. She was dressed in a tailored cream-colored coat, carrying herself with quiet confidence as she thanked the driver and adjusted her handbag. Daniel's heartbeat seemed to stop. Every part of him refused to believe what his eyes were seeing. The owner of the apartment building, the woman whose lawyers had refused every extension, the person responsible for forcing his family onto the street, was his own wife, Vanessa Brooks. For several long seconds he couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even convince himself that what he was witnessing was real. His mind searched desperately for another explanation, but none came. The woman he had kissed goodbye that very morning was calmly walking into the courthouse to finalize the eviction proceedings against her own husband. For 6 years, Daniel believed he had been paying rent to a wealthy property owner he had never met. Month after month, despite financial setbacks, despite exhausting workdays and mounting debt, he made sure those payments were sent on time because protecting his family meant everything to him. He never imagined that every dollar he fought so hard to earn had been flowing into accounts secretly controlled by the woman he loved more than anyone else. Yet as impossible as that discovery seemed, it was only the beginning. Because hidden beneath years of quiet smiles, reassuring words, and shared family dinners was another secret, one that would force Daniel to question whether the last 8 years of his marriage had been built on love or on one carefully guarded deception. Before we go any deeper into this unbelievable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Daniel uncovered next would answer one question, but it would raise many more. Why would a loving wife secretly become her husband's landlord? Why allow the father of her children to struggle, borrow money, and face eviction if she had the power to stop it at any moment? And perhaps the most heartbreaking question of all, if Vanessa had hidden something this enormous for so many years, what else had she been keeping from the men who believed they shared everything? If you had asked Daniel Brooks that morning whether he truly knew his wife, he would have answered without hesitation. 8 years of marriage had convinced him that there were no more surprises left between them. They had celebrated anniversaries, welcomed 2 children into the world, survived financial hardships together, and shared countless conversations about dreams, fears, and the future. To Daniel, Vanessa wasn't simply his wife. She was his closest friend, his greatest source of comfort, and the one person he believed would never give him a reason to question her loyalty. Yet standing outside that courthouse, watching her walk confidently toward the same lawyer who had spent months demanding his eviction, Daniel felt as though every memory they had built together was being rewritten before his eyes. The woman he thought he knew suddenly seemed like a complete stranger, and the questions racing through his mind refused to slow down. Who was Vanessa Brooks when she wasn't sitting across the dinner table or helping their children with homework? How could the woman who held his hand during their hardest nights secretly own the very building she had allowed him to struggle to keep? More importantly, if she had hidden something this enormous without leaving a single clue, what else had she managed to conceal over the years? The answers didn't come immediately. Instead, every attempt Daniel made to understand the truth only uncovered another layer of confusion. Friends who had known Vanessa for years insisted she came from an ordinary middle-class family. Former neighbors described her as kind, quiet, and devoted to her children. Her co-workers believed she earned an average salary and lived a simple life. Nothing about her public image suggested she possessed the wealth required to own multiple residential properties. Even Daniel himself had handled family budgets, discussed overdue bills, and worried with her over rising expenses. There were evenings when they sat together at the kitchen table calculating which bills could wait until the following month. Vanessa had cried with him when his construction business began losing contracts. She had embraced him after he sold his pickup truck to cover household expenses. She had even encouraged him when he borrowed money from friends to keep food on the table. Looking back, every one of those moments now carried a different meaning. Were those tears genuine, or had they simply been part of a performance that had lasted nearly a decade? Daniel wanted to believe there had to be a reasonable explanation because accepting the alternative meant admitting that the person he trusted most had watched him suffer while quietly holding the power to end his struggles at any moment. As Daniel replayed every conversation, every financial setback, and every difficult decision they had faced together, small details he had ignored for years suddenly began demanding his attention. Why had Vanessa always insisted on handling certain documents herself? Why had she discouraged him from asking questions whenever official mail arrived? Why had every communication from the landlord come through attorneys instead of a personal meeting? At the time, none of it seemed unusual. Now, those memories formed pieces of a puzzle Daniel could no longer ignore. He made a decision that would change his life forever. He would stop asking Vanessa for answers and begin searching for them himself. He had no idea that the deeper he looked, the more disturbing the picture would become, and before long, he would uncover evidence suggesting that the eviction notice was only one chapter in a much larger story built on years of carefully guarded secrets. Long before an eviction notice landed in Daniel Brooks' hands, there was a time when almost everyone who knew the Brooks family believed they had built the kind of life many people spend decades chasing. Daniel Brooks, a 46-year-old Black American construction business owner, had earned a reputation as a man whose word carried more value than a signed contract. He wasn't the wealthiest businessman in town, but clients respected his honesty, employees admired his leadership, and neighbors often described him as the kind of husband and father every family wished they had. He believed success wasn't measured by luxury cars or expensive watches but by whether his wife smiled when he walked through the front door and whether his children felt safe whenever he wrapped his arms around them. 8 years earlier, when he married Vanessa Brooks, a graceful, intelligent 42-year-old white American whose calm personality balanced his energetic nature, Daniel believed he had found the missing piece of his life. Friends joked that they complemented each other perfectly. Daniel was expressive and warm, while Vanessa was thoughtful, organized, and composed even during difficult moments. Together, they welcomed 2 beautiful children into the world. Ethan, their energetic 9-year-old son, dreamed of becoming an engineer just like the people who designed the skyscrapers his father helped build. Lily, only 6 years old, filled every room with laughter and possessed the rare ability to make even complete strangers smile. From the outside, the Brooks family represented stability, love, and the quiet beauty of an ordinary American family building a future together. Their home reflected everything Daniel had worked for. It wasn't a mansion, but it was spacious, elegant, and located in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the county. Family photographs decorated the walls from the entrance to the upstairs hallway. One picture captured Ethan sitting proudly on Daniel's shoulders during a 4th of July parade. Another showed Lily covered in birthday cake frosting while Vanessa laughed beside her. Summer vacations had taken them to beaches along the Florida coast, where Daniel spent hours teaching Ethan how to cast a fishing line while Vanessa and Lily searched the shoreline for colorful seashells. Thanksgiving dinners filled the dining room with relatives, homemade recipes, and conversations that stretched late into the evening. Weekend barbecues became a tradition, with Daniel standing beside the grill while neighborhood children chased one another across the backyard until sunset. Every Christmas morning began with hot chocolate, wrapped presents, and Vanessa insisting that nobody open a single gift until she had taken photographs of the family together. Looking back, those moments seemed almost too perfect, like treasured memories frozen in time before life unexpectedly changed direction. To everyone watching from the outside, the Brooks family had achieved something many people only imagined. They loved one another, worked hard, raised respectful children, and appeared united through every season of life. Yet even during those happiest years, there were moments so ordinary that Daniel barely noticed them, moments that would later return to him with unsettling clarity. Whenever official mail arrived, Vanessa was always the first to collect it from the mailbox. She would quickly separate envelopes into neat piles before placing a few inside a drawer in their bedroom that Daniel rarely opened. If he casually reached for a document while paying monthly bills, Vanessa would smile gently and say, "Don't worry about the finances. I'll take care of it." Daniel never questioned her because trust had become the foundation of their marriage. He appreciated having a wife who enjoyed organizing paperwork, managing household expenses, and keeping important records in order. She handled insurance renewals, tax documents, school registrations, and every letter connected to their home. Whenever paperwork required a signature, Vanessa would quietly point to the correct place, explain only what Daniel needed to know, and file everything away once it was completed. To Daniel, this wasn't suspicious. It was simply another example of how well they worked as a team. He focused on earning a living while Vanessa handled administrative responsibilities at home. Friends often admired how organized she seemed, and Daniel frequently praised her for making life easier during the busiest years of his construction business. He had no reason to imagine that some of the documents she carefully protected contained information she never intended for him to see. As the years passed, these routines became so familiar that Daniel stopped noticing them altogether. Every relationship develops habits that eventually feel normal, and theirs was no different. Vanessa remained supportive whenever work became stressful, encouraging Daniel after difficult projects and reminding him that every challenge eventually passed. She celebrated his successes without seeking attention for herself and stood quietly beside him whenever life demanded patience. Nothing about her behavior suggested she was living a separate financial life hidden behind carefully chosen words and routine responsibilities. Even the children adored the balance between their parents. Ethan often said his father could fix anything with his hands, while Lily insisted her mother always knew the answer to every question. It was the kind of family dynamic people admired without realizing how little they truly knew about the private details of another household. Then, one ordinary afternoon, among utility bills, school newsletters, and advertisements, a single unopened envelope arrived in the mailbox. It looked no different from dozens of others that had come before it, yet the information sealed inside would become the first loose thread in a carefully woven secret. Once that envelope was opened, Daniel Brooks would begin asking questions he had never thought to ask before, and the comfortable life he believed he understood would never look the same again. The envelope Daniel Brooks had dreaded finally arrived on a cold Monday morning, delivered with the same ordinary routine as every other piece of mail that had entered their home over the years. There were no flashing warnings, no dramatic announcement, just a thick white envelope addressed to him with the law firm's return address printed neatly in the upper corner. Before he even opened it, something inside him already knew this wasn't another reminder or another request for payment. His hands trembled as he unfolded the letter and slowly read each line. The property owner had rejected every previous request for additional time. The outstanding balance remained unpaid. Daniel Brooks, his wife Vanessa Brooks, and their 2 children were ordered to vacate the apartment within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in legal enforcement of the eviction. Daniel read the notice again and then a third time, hoping he had misunderstood something. This wasn't just another financial setback. This was the end of the home where Ethan had taken his first steps, where Lily had celebrated every birthday she could remember, and where Daniel still believed his family would someday laugh about the difficult years they had overcome together. He quietly folded the notice before looking toward the living room where his children were playing without the slightest idea that their lives were about to change forever. Vanessa stood beside him as he explained what the letter said, and for a brief moment she appeared just as devastated as he was. Tears gathered in her eyes as she asked what they were going to do if no one was willing to give them another chance. Daniel wrapped his arms around her and promised that somehow, no matter how impossible things seemed, he would find a way to keep his family together. That promise became his only purpose. During the following days he called former clients, old friends, distant relatives, and anyone who might be willing to help him raise enough money to stop the eviction. He offered to work weekends without pay in exchange for future contracts. He considered selling the few valuable possessions he still owned, including tools he depended on for work. Every rejection felt heavier than the last, but Daniel refused to stop trying because failure no longer meant losing money. It meant watching his children leave the only home they had ever known. Throughout those exhausting weeks, Vanessa remained calm, comforting him whenever another opportunity disappeared. She encouraged him to stay hopeful, insisting that something would eventually work out. Daniel believed every word because he had never imagined there was any reason not to trust the woman who had shared every chapter of his adult life. Running out of time, Daniel made one final decision. If the lawyers refused every proposal, then he would appeal directly to the person who owned the building. Surely, he thought, no reasonable property owner would ignore the circumstances of a hard-working father desperately trying to protect his family. He contacted the law office repeatedly until an assistant reluctantly agreed to arrange a brief meeting. When Daniel finally sat across from the attorney handling the property, he spoke from the heart rather than from prepared notes. He explained how his business had collapsed after losing major contracts, how he was rebuilding one project at a time, and how his family simply needed a little more time to recover. He described Ethan's recent medical emergency, the debts that had followed, and the determination that kept him waking before sunrise every morning despite everything working against him. The lawyer listened patiently without interrupting. When Daniel finished speaking, the attorney calmly closed the file resting on his desk and delivered a sentence that echoed in Daniel's mind long after he left the office. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks," he said quietly. "The owner doesn't make exceptions." There was no anger in his voice, no satisfaction, only a firm certainty that the decision had already been made. Daniel leaned forward and asked the one question that suddenly felt impossible to ignore. "Who owns this building?" The lawyer's expression changed almost immediately. After a brief silence, he simply replied that the owner's identity was private and could not be disclosed. No explanation. No further discussion. The meeting was over. As Daniel walked back to his truck, something about that conversation refused to leave him alone. It wasn't just the refusal to negotiate. It was the unusual determination to keep the owner's identity hidden. For 6 years he had paid every rent payment through the same law office. Not once had he spoken to the landlord, received a personal letter, or even learned a name. At first, that arrangement had seemed perfectly ordinary. Many property owners preferred to let attorneys or management companies handle tenant matters. But now, after being denied even the chance to plead his case directly, Daniel couldn't ignore the growing feeling that something about this situation didn't add up. Why would a landlord refuse to meet a tenant who had faithfully paid rent for years until financial hardship changed everything? Why guard something as simple as a name? The questions followed him home that evening and stayed with him long after everyone else had gone to bed. Lying awake in the darkness, Daniel reached a decision that would change the course of his life. If no one was willing to tell him who owned the building, he would find the answer himself. He had no way of knowing that his search would uncover a truth far more devastating than the eviction notice itself, a truth that would force him to question every year of his marriage to Vanessa Brooks. The following morning, Daniel Brooks made a decision that surprised even him. For years, he had accepted every explanation given to him without question because trust had always been the foundation of his marriage. He trusted the lawyer who collected the rent. He trusted the paperwork that arrived every year. Most of all, he trusted Vanessa Brooks. But after leaving that law office with more questions than answers, something inside him refused to remain silent. If no one was willing to tell him who owned the apartment building, then he would find out on his own. What began as a desperate attempt to save his family's home quickly became a search for answers that would consume every free hour he had. Daniel started with the county records office, believing the process would be simple. Every property had an owner, and every owner left a paper trail somewhere. Sitting inside the quiet government building, surrounded by shelves filled with decades of public records, he requested information about the apartment complex where his family had lived for 6 years. The clerk entered the address into the system before printing several documents and sliding them across the counter. Daniel expected to see the name of a wealthy investor or a real estate company he had never heard of. Instead, he found the name of a limited liability company. There was no individual listed, only a business entity that owned the property. At first, it seemed like another dead end. Large apartment buildings were often owned by corporations rather than individuals, and Daniel almost convinced himself he had wasted his morning. Still, something told him not to stop there. Over the next several days, Daniel followed every lead he could find. He visited the local property registry, where additional records showed that the same company owned several residential buildings throughout the county. Curious, he contacted an old real estate agent who had once helped him search for commercial property years earlier. The agent recognized the company's name immediately but admitted no one seemed to know who actually controlled it. That only deepened Daniel's curiosity. Every answer created another question. The company had purchased properties over many years, always through attorneys and financial representatives, leaving almost no public connection to the real owner. Daniel then reached out to a former banking acquaintance who explained that businesses like these were often held by trusts designed to protect the privacy of wealthy investors. It was perfectly legal, but it also made discovering the true owner far more difficult. Days turned into weeks as Daniel traveled from one office to another, requesting records, comparing signatures, and reading documents that made little sense at first. Each evening he returned home exhausted, pretending everything was normal so Ethan and Lily wouldn't notice the growing concern on his face. Vanessa watched him closely during those days, occasionally asking where he had been, but Daniel answered vaguely, saying he was still trying to find a way to stop the eviction. She nodded calmly every time, never pressing him for details, never showing the slightest concern that her husband had begun asking questions no one had expected him to ask. Finally, one afternoon, an employee at the county office quietly suggested Daniel request the registration documents connected to the trust listed on one of the filings. It required additional paperwork and several hours of waiting, but before the office closed, a thick file was placed in front of him. Daniel slowly turned each page, following the ownership structure one document at a time. The apartment building belonged to the real estate company. The real estate company belonged to a private investment trust. The trust had one controlling beneficiary whose name had remained hidden behind layers of legal paperwork for years. Daniel stared at the final page, convinced he had misunderstood what he was reading. He blinked several times before reading the name again. Vanessa Brooks. His wife. The woman he had shared a bed with for 8 years. The mother of his children. The woman who had comforted him every night as he worried about paying the rent. Daniel's hands began shaking so badly that the papers slipped from his fingers onto the desk. He gathered them quickly and read every page again, searching for a mistake, another Vanessa Brooks, another explanation that would make everything return to normal. But every document confirmed the same unbelievable truth. The signatures matched. The dates matched. The legal filings stretched back years before his financial troubles had even begun. This wasn't a recent purchase made without his knowledge. Vanessa had controlled the property throughout nearly their entire marriage. Every rent payment he had struggled to make had ultimately found its way into assets connected to his own wife. For several minutes, Daniel remained seated without moving. The sounds around him faded into the background as memories replayed one after another. Vanessa crying beside him when bills became overwhelming. Vanessa encouraging him to borrow money because they had no other choice. Vanessa reassuring him that better days would come while she quietly knew she possessed the resources to end their hardship at any moment. His heart wanted to reject the evidence spread across the table because accepting it meant accepting that nearly every financial struggle they had shared together had been built on a secret she had deliberately protected. Yet as devastating as this discovery was, another folder inside the file caught Daniel's attention. It contained financial statements, acquisition records, and documents connected to additional properties. At first he almost ignored it, believing he had already uncovered the worst possible truth. Then he noticed the numbers printed across the pages. His breathing slowed as he realized the apartment building wasn't the only thing Vanessa had hidden from him. There was something much larger buried inside those records, something that explained years of unexplained decisions and unanswered questions. And as Daniel turned the next page, he understood that discovering his wife owned their apartment building had only revealed the beginning of a far greater deception. Daniel Brooks remained seated in the records office long after everyone around him had returned to their daily routines. The folder lying open in front of him no longer looked like a collection of legal documents. It looked like 8 years of his life rewritten in black ink. His eyes moved from one page to another, each document revealing another piece of a reality he had never imagined existed. The apartment building where his family lived was only one small part of a much larger collection of assets. There were ownership certificates for additional apartment complexes in neighboring counties. There were commercial properties leased to established businesses, investment accounts that had quietly grown over the years, undeveloped land purchased at strategic locations, and financial statements showing income that exceeded anything Daniel had ever earned during the best years of his construction business. The estimated value of the portfolio reached several $1,000,000. Daniel leaned back in his chair, unable to process what he was seeing. He had spent months believing his family was standing on the edge of financial collapse while the woman he loved possessed enough wealth to erase every debt they carried. Every page he turned removed another excuse he had desperately tried to invent for Vanessa. He wanted to believe there had been a misunderstanding, a legal technicality, or some forgotten inheritance she had only recently received. Instead, the documents told a completely different story. Much of the wealth had entered Vanessa's life years before they were married through a carefully managed inheritance from a relative whose estate had been placed under professional trustees. Over time, she had quietly expanded those assets, purchasing more properties, reinvesting rental income, and building a financial empire almost entirely hidden from the men who shared her home. Nothing about it had happened overnight. Every decision had required planning, signatures, meetings with attorneys, accountants, and financial advisors. It had taken years to build, which meant it had also taken years to conceal. As Daniel continued reading, memories he had treasured for years returned with a meaning he had never considered before. He remembered the evening Ethan was rushed to the hospital after developing a severe infection that required emergency treatment. Daniel had emptied the family's savings account before borrowing money from co-workers and longtime friends because the hospital required immediate payment before moving forward with certain procedures. He could still remember sitting alone in the hospital parking lot after midnight, making phone calls he never wanted to make, asking people for financial help while trying to hide the embarrassment in his voice. Vanessa had cried beside him inside the waiting room, holding his hand, whispering that everything would somehow work out because they had each other. At the time, Daniel believed every tear she shed reflected the same fear he carried inside his heart. Now, that memory became almost unbearable. According to the financial records spread across the table, Vanessa had possessed more than enough money to pay every medical expense without borrowing a single dollar. She had the ability to protect their son from unnecessary delays, to spare Daniel the humiliation of begging for help, and to prevent months of crushing debt that followed the hospital stay. Yet she had remained silent. Then came another memory. The yearly rent increases that always seemed impossible to challenge. Every time Daniel questioned whether the landlord might reconsider, Vanessa gently encouraged him to stay patient and assured him they would eventually catch up. When overtime work exhausted him, she reminded him that he was doing it for their family. When he sold his pickup truck to cover overdue expenses, she hugged him tightly and thanked him for making such a difficult sacrifice. Every comforting conversation replayed in his mind alongside the documents proving that the rent checks he worked so hard to earn had never disappeared into the account of an anonymous landlord. They had been flowing into financial structures controlled by Vanessa herself. Every increase in rent. Every extension denied. Every excuse. Every promise that better days were coming. They all looked completely different now. Daniel closed the final folder and walked slowly toward the parking lot, but the weight he carried had nothing to do with the papers in his hands. It was the unbearable realization that trust, once broken at this level, left almost every shared memory open to question. Had Vanessa ever intended to tell him the truth? Had she married him because she loved him, or because keeping her financial life hidden had become easier than explaining it? Were the difficult years they had survived together truly shared hardships, or had Daniel been fighting battles alone while believing they stood on the same side? During the drive home, he replayed hundreds of conversations in his mind, noticing details he had ignored for years. Vanessa always insisted on collecting the mail before anyone else. She handled tax documents herself. She discouraged Daniel whenever he offered to organize household finances. She preferred lawyers to communicate with tenants instead of property managers. Every small decision suddenly fit together with painful clarity. By the time he pulled into the driveway, one conclusion had become impossible to escape. The woman waiting inside the house knew exactly who owned the apartment building. She knew where every rent payment had gone. She knew why the lawyer refused to reveal the owner's identity. And she had watched her husband exhaust himself trying to save a home she already controlled. Daniel remained seated in his truck for several minutes, staring at the front door where Ethan and Lily had so often rushed outside to greet him after work. The home looked exactly the same, but nothing about it felt familiar anymore. He reached for the folder resting beside him, took one deep breath, and stepped out of the truck. For the first time since the day they exchanged wedding vows, Daniel Brooks wasn't walking toward his wife to share another ordinary evening. He was walking toward the most painful conversation of his life, knowing that whatever happened next would determine whether their marriage had any future at all. Daniel Brooks stood outside the front door longer than he ever had before. Countless memories lived within those walls. It was where he had carried Vanessa across the threshold on the day they moved in. It was where Ethan took his first steps while Daniel cheered louder than anyone else in the room. It was where Lily insisted on sleeping between her parents after every thunderstorm because she believed nothing bad could happen as long as they were together. For years, this house had represented safety, love, and the future Daniel had worked so hard to build. Now it felt like the setting of a life he no longer recognized. He quietly walked inside and found Vanessa setting the dinner table as though it were any other evening. She smiled when she saw him, but the smile slowly disappeared the moment she noticed the thick folder tucked beneath his arm. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse her. He simply placed the documents on the dining table, one page after another, until the ownership records, financial statements, trust agreements, and property registrations covered nearly every inch of the polished wood. Vanessa looked down at the papers, then back at Daniel. In that moment, neither of them spoke. The silence itself carried more weight than any argument ever could. Daniel watched her expression carefully, hoping to see confusion or disbelief, anything that suggested the records were wrong. Instead, he saw recognition. She knew exactly what those documents were. She knew what they revealed. And without saying a single word, Daniel realized she had understood this day might eventually come. Several long moments passed before Vanessa slowly lowered herself into a chair. She didn't deny the signatures. She didn't question the records. She didn't claim someone had forged her name or manipulated the documents. Her shoulders dropped as though she had been carrying an invisible burden for years, and in a quiet voice she finally admitted that everything Daniel had discovered was true. She owned the apartment building. She owned the other residential properties. She owned commercial real estate, investment accounts, and land that continued to increase in value every year. She admitted that much of her wealth had come through an inheritance after the death of a close family member years before they married. Instead of sharing that truth with Daniel, she chose to place everything under trusts and professional management while keeping her personal finances completely separate from their marriage. At first, she told herself she was simply being careful. Growing up, she had watched her father lose nearly everything during a painful divorce that left him emotionally and financially broken. The experience shaped the way she viewed money, trust, and relationships. She convinced herself that complete financial privacy was the only way to guarantee she would never face the same future. Even after falling in love with Daniel, marrying him, and starting a family together, that fear never completely disappeared. She kept postponing the conversation, promising herself she would explain everything later, after another anniversary, after another promotion, after another year had passed. But every year that went by made the truth more difficult to reveal. Secrecy slowly became habit, and habit slowly became deception. Before she realized what had happened, the lie had become so large that admitting it seemed impossible. So she continued living two separate financial lives, telling herself she was protecting herself when, in reality, she was quietly destroying the very marriage she wanted to preserve. Daniel listened without interrupting, but every explanation only deepened the pain already written across his face. He remembered every sacrifice he had made believing they were struggling together. He remembered the nights he worked until exhaustion, the loans he accepted despite the embarrassment, the possessions he sold, and the promises he made to his children that everything would eventually be okay. None of those memories could be separated from the knowledge he now carried. Vanessa had possessed the ability to change their circumstances at almost any moment, yet she had chosen silence. Finally, Daniel asked the one question that had haunted him from the moment he read the financial records. His voice was calm, almost heartbreakingly calm, as he looked directly into Vanessa's eyes. "When our son almost died, were you ever going to tell me?" The room became completely still. Vanessa opened her mouth as though searching for an answer, but no words came. Her eyes filled with tears, yet she couldn't bring herself to speak. She lowered her head, staring at the floor where countless family memories had once been made, and for the first time since Daniel arrived home, silence became her only response. It was that silence, more than the hidden properties, the millions of dollars, or the years of deception, that finally shattered whatever hope remained inside Daniel Brooks. In that single unanswered moment, he understood that some questions carry consequences far greater than any answer ever could, and he quietly realized that the conversation they had just shared was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning of everything they were about to lose. The hardest endings are rarely marked by shouting, slammed doors, or dramatic final words. More often, they arrive quietly, disguised as silence between two people who once believed nothing could ever separate them. That was exactly how the final chapter of Daniel Brooks and Vanessa Brooks' marriage began. After everything had been revealed, after every document had been placed on the dining table, after every painful question had been asked and every confession had been made, Daniel finally understood there was one thing Vanessa could never return to him. It wasn't the rent money. It wasn't the years he had spent working himself to exhaustion. It wasn't the loans he had borrowed, the possessions he had sold, or the sleepless nights he had endured wondering how to keep his family from becoming homeless. What she had taken from him was something far more valuable. She had taken away his certainty that the person standing beside him would always face life's hardships with him honestly. Once that certainty disappeared, the marriage they had spent 8 years building no longer rested on the same foundation. Daniel didn't leave because he hated Vanessa. He left because every room inside that beautiful house reminded him of promises that no longer carried the same meaning. Every family photograph hanging on the walls reminded him that while he had been sharing every burden openly, Vanessa had quietly carried an entirely different reality without ever inviting him into it. Walking away from the home was the most painful decision he had ever made, yet remaining there would have meant pretending that trust could somehow be rebuilt overnight. Some wounds require distance before healing can even begin, and Daniel knew that if he stayed, the pain would only continue growing. The legal process that followed was long, emotional, and exhausting for everyone involved, but throughout it all, Daniel made one request that never changed. Whatever happened between him and Vanessa, Ethan and Lily should never become weapons in a battle they didn't create. Family counselors worked closely with both parents to help the children understand that although their mother and father would no longer live together, they would never stop loving them. The court eventually approved an arrangement allowing Ethan and Lily to spend meaningful time with both parents while providing them with as much stability as possible during such a difficult transition. Daniel rented a modest home not far from the children's school. It was smaller than the house they had once shared, and many of the luxuries they had enjoyed were gone, but the children quickly discovered something that couldn't be measured by square footage or expensive furniture. Whenever they were with their father, they felt heard, protected, and deeply loved. Daniel continued rebuilding his construction business one project at a time, determined to prove to himself and to his children that integrity was still worth holding onto, even after life had tested it in the cruelest way. He never spoke publicly about Vanessa with bitterness because he understood that carrying resentment forever would only create another prison. Instead, he chose to let his actions teach Ethan and Lily lessons that words never could. He wanted them to grow into adults who believed honesty was more valuable than wealth and that real strength was measured by character rather than the balance inside a bank account. For Vanessa Brooks, however, every day became a reminder that some losses cannot be repaired with money. The apartment buildings remained profitable. The commercial properties continued generating income month after month. The investment accounts quietly increased in value, and the land she had accumulated years earlier became even more valuable as new developments expanded across the region. Financially, she had everything she once believed would guarantee her security. Yet every evening, she returned to a house that had become painfully quiet. The dining table where the family once shared dinner now sat untouched for days at a time. Ethan's backpack no longer rested near the staircase every afternoon. Lily's drawings stopped appearing on the refrigerator door. Weekend barbecues disappeared. Holiday mornings became shorter and far less joyful because they no longer began with the entire family gathered together. The silence inside the house gradually became louder than any argument they had ever shared. One evening, while organizing old family photographs, Vanessa came across a picture taken years earlier during a summer picnic. Daniel stood smiling with Ethan sitting proudly on his shoulders while little Lily laughed beside them, and Vanessa herself looked happier than she could remember feeling in years. She stared at that photograph for a long time before gently placing it back inside the album. For the first time, she fully understood that the fortune she had spent years protecting had come at a price she never expected to pay. Money had purchased beautiful homes, profitable investments, and financial freedom, but it could not buy another bedtime story with her children under the same roof, another ordinary family dinner filled with laughter, or another opportunity to erase the years of silence that slowly destroyed the trust between her and the men who had loved her without reservation. In the end, Daniel Brooks left with far less money than Vanessa Brooks, but he carried something she would spend the rest of her life wishing she had protected more carefully. His integrity remained intact. And Vanessa was left to face a truth that no investment portfolio could ever change: wealth can replace almost anything in life except the trust of the people who once called you family. Some betrayals don't begin with lies. They begin with secrets. Small secrets that seem harmless at first. Secrets that are justified with good intentions, protected by fear, and hidden behind ordinary smiles. Over time, those secrets grow heavier, creating invisible walls between people who once believed they shared everything. By the time the truth finally comes to light, it is often too late to recover what has already been lost. Daniel Brooks believed he was fighting to save his family's home from an anonymous landlord who refused to show mercy. He believed that every extra hour he worked, every dollar he borrowed, and every sacrifice he made was bringing his family one step closer to safety. He never imagined that the person collecting the reward for those sacrifices was the woman he loved, trusted, and promised to spend the rest of his life with. The greatest shock was never discovering that Vanessa Brooks was wealthy. It was discovering that while he carried the burden of protecting their family alone, she quietly watched from a position where she could have changed everything with a single decision. That realization became far more painful than losing a house because homes can be replaced. Trust cannot. Stories like Daniel and Vanessa's remind us that relationships are rarely destroyed by one dramatic moment alone. More often, they are weakened by conversations that never happen, truths that remain hidden, and fears that are allowed to grow instead of being shared. Vanessa convinced herself that protecting her financial independence would protect her future. Daniel believed unconditional trust was the strongest foundation a marriage could have. Neither of them imagined those two beliefs would eventually collide in a way that would cost them the family they spent years building together. Ethan and Lily would grow up remembering parents who loved them deeply, yet they would also carry the memory of a family changed forever by silence. Perhaps that is the most heartbreaking lesson of all. Money can solve many problems, but it cannot restore years that have already passed. It cannot erase painful memories, repair broken confidence, or recreate moments that disappeared the day trust was lost. Wealth can build houses, purchase land, and create financial security, but only honesty can build the kind of home where people truly feel safe with one another. Every decision we make inside a relationship, even the ones we believe are protecting us, carries consequences that often reach much further than we expect. Now we'd like to hear from you. If you discovered that the person you loved had secretly hidden an entire fortune while watching you struggle to provide for your family, could you ever forgive them? Would you believe their explanation that fear from the past influenced their choices, or would that betrayal permanently change the way you saw them? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because every perspective tells a different story, and respectful conversations often help us see situations from angles we may never have considered. Before we end today's story, let us know where you're watching from. We always enjoy seeing how people from different cities, states, and countries connect through these powerful stories. And if this story made you question how well we really know the people closest to us, don't forget to subscribe to My Frame Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable documentary-style story filled with mystery, emotion, betrayal, and thought-provoking moments inspired by the complexities of real life. Thank you for spending this time with us, and until our next story, remember that the strongest relationships are not built on perfect circumstances or endless wealth. They are built on truth, transparency, and the courage to trust one another completely, even when doing so feels difficult.